Yo, this is Zist. Today we're going to take a look at the Lyra Prototype Interaction System. As of 5.0.3, this is still in prototype mode. It will not work for you without some minor changes. I'll show you how to make those changes so that you can play with this yourself. In addition to that, I've made two very minor changes that it's going to look a little bit different than yours, but it'll help with visualizations here. A couple of things to pay attention to here. There are two gameplay tasks that are working together here in order to enable interactions. One is this yellow sphere that you see above me, below me, all around me. This is an interaction scan that's looking everything in this sphere 10 times per second to see are there interactable objects in this sphere. And if so, it gives me a gameplay ability. So that's one task. The second task is this green line, which when I get close enough to something turns red and says, hey, there's something there you can interact with. So next are these rocks. Each of these objects here, these gray boxes, these are rocks. And we can pick up these rocks if we get close enough. So as we close, you see now my yellow sphere. Yellow means no interactable objects in range. As I get closer, now the yellow sphere is clipping on the rock, so it turns teal. It's telling me there is now an interactable object nearby. However, the green line in the middle of the screen says you're too far away, you still can't interact with it. So as we get closer, now we can interact. So now when I push the interact key, I pick up the rock. And so I can interact with all of these rocks, pick them all up. I now have 6 rocks in my inventory. This is the Lyra Interaction System. When you first load this up, you're going to want to go to ShooterMaps, PROTO, InventoryTest, and there is a test map here. So we'll open that up. Now, if you just run this, you'll see that there's no way to interact. There's no green line. If I'm pushing interaction key here, nothing happens. So this is what's expected. This doesn't work without a couple of changes. So let's take a look at the changes. First thing you're going to need to do is open up a couple of assets. I will link exactly what the assets are so that you can do this on your own. There are 4 different assets that you need to open. The last of which is a key binding, and you see here IA interact is connected to the E key, which is bad because that is also the melee key, and you saw me meleeing rather than interacting. So I'm going to change this to the T key and save. And now when we come back, now you see there is the green/red line. And when we get close, we can interact. So we push the interact key, which is now T, and we pick up the rock. And so there you go. Now it's working without the extra visualizations that I showed you earlier. So now we're going to take a look at my blog, which I will also link in the video description. We're not going to go through this whole thing, but we are going to go through the key concepts part here. So I'll blow this up for those of you who are on phones. Key concepts. There is an ability called GA Interact. This constantly scans the area around you looking for interactable objects. So in the opening sequence, there was the sphere around the player. That was this ability that was making that sphere and checking, are there interactable objects in the area? When it finds any interactable objects, it grants the player abilities based on what those objects are. So that's one key concept, the GA interact ability. Another one is an interactable object itself. So for example, the rock. And so the rock does nothing, but when you get close to it, this GA interact says, oh, here's a rock. And then the rock says, hey, here's an ability that can interact with me. And the ability that the rock gives is this one, GA interact collect. So the rock gives this ability to the player via this ability. That's basically how it works. Okay, so we'll look at each of those in more detail. The GA interact ability. Here's the path to get to it. GA Interact ability gets added to the player state by the test inventory experience. When the GA Interact ability gets activated, a couple of things happen. First of all, in the base C++ class, this ability grant nearby interaction gameplay task is activated. So this is the gameplay task, which is scanning 10 times a second in a sphere around the player looking for interactable objects. Next, in the blueprint itself of GA Interact, it starts a second gameplay task, which is this wait for interactable targets single line trace. So this is the one that also 10 times a second is making the green or red line that comes out in front of the player to see, are we close enough to interact? And finally, there's an async loop, which is listening for interaction key presses. So all three of these things are done by GA Interact. So let's take a look at GA Interact. We are in Lyra, ShooterMaps, PROTO, InventoryTest, Input, Abilities. Here's GA Interact. Let's open that up. This is a Lyra gameplay ability interact. So let's take a look at that. This is a Lyra gameplay ability. It overrides the activate ability, and it adds a couple of other functions that we're not going to take a look at. But activate ability we will look at. This calls the super, and it immediately activates this ability task, grant nearby interaction. So that is the base class of the GA Interact blueprint. When this ability activates, which is on spawn, the activation policy is on spawn. So when it activates, it runs the base class stuff that we just looked at. Then it calls look for interactables, and it calls interact press scan. So look for interactables is this event, which starts a wait for interactable targets single line trace that runs every 0.1 second, so 10 times a second, looking 200 centimeters in front of us. And it's calling this update interaction. So basically, find all the interactable options that are in front of us within this range at this interval and update interactions 10 times a second. Also, interact press scan, which just waits for the input key to be pressed and then calls trigger interaction and then loops back and calls itself again and waits again. And so this just loops and loops and loops as long as this gameplay ability is active. Every time you push the input, it's going to try and trigger an interaction if this single line trace has found interactable objects and updated the interactions. So we now have the GA Interact, which is constantly running in the background. It's looking for interactables. It's looking to see, are we close enough to interact with something? So we need to look now at an interactable object. So this is a interactable rock. The interactable rock is very simple. Over here, it defines interaction ability to grant as GA interaction collect. And it says when we pick up the rock, we're going to get one item, which is a rock. The static mesh has a collision override, so there's custom collision. So it's set to overlap with the Lyra trace channel interaction. This is very important. You must have this overlapping. So now let's take a look back here at the gameplay ability defined by the rock. Here it is in the Interact folder. Now this is just a Lyra gameplay ability. It's a vanilla ability. There's no base class functionality. And what this does is it's invoked by the trigger event. We have a couple of variables here. One is the target, which is which rock did we interact with, and one is the instigator, which is which player picked up the rock. So first thing we do, the rock itself, we disable collision and we set it to die in 3 seconds. Then we trigger this gameplay queue, which says, hey, we have collected a rock. On the server, we then actually add a rock to the inventory. On the client, we just broadcast a message saying, hey, there's a rock incoming. And either way, then we play this animation montage and we end the ability. If this video doesn't suck, please like, subscribe, share it with somebody, whatever. See you next time.